Hey there, this is Jake Reynes, and this is an overview video for my Graffiti Writer Pro Procreate brush set. I've been working on this brush set for a couple months, and I have been able to recreate some really interesting effects using Procreate's dual brush layers as well as their color capabilities to create really interesting outline and 3D effects. I will be the first to admit that I am not a graffiti writer myself, but I have worked with a lot of graffiti writers in my past, composing murals, who are very used to working at large scales in a variety of different styles. And I've had them kind of help me fine tune and finesse this brush set to suit their needs for creating their work on the iPad. So I will also drop a link to a timestamp later on in this video where I'm going to go through a little bit more of the tools in general and how you can kind of create interesting compositions and effects. But the first part of this video is meant to be a kind of overview of the brush set and what it contains. So feel free to jump ahead if you're already familiar with it. So I will go to a blank layer here, and just to give you a peek into the brush set, there are a total of 63 brushes. So there are 3D chisels that follow a variety of left and right 3D, shallow and deep, as well as some grunge effects. They're the same variety of brushes and fine liners, so these are going to respond differently to your pen pressure. They're more expressive chisels that are a little bit more appropriate for hand styles, or if you're going to work with a chisel paint marker, can emulate some cool effects. Same thing, the expressive fine liners, but they'll respond to your pressure differently. There are outline chisels that create a variety of textures and interesting effects when you start to pair in color. There are a variety of fine liners that mimic those same styles, but again, will respond to your pen pressure differently. And then finally, I have some spray paint textures, or variety of different textures that will be familiar if you've used my Graffiti Pro brush set. And I'll show you again later in this video, but I really like to use these for using for kind of backgrounds to get a base down before I start adding letters, and also to add on as little effects at the end. So a lot of brushes here, 63 in total. I'm not going to go through every single one of them, but I will give you a quick glimpse into each. And so the majority of these, aside from the last 5 texture brushes, use Procreate's dual brush feature. And by that, I mean there are actually 2 brushes on top of each other, and each one has its own color attributes. So if I was to just draw a line here, you're not going to see anything because I'm working on a white background. But you'll notice in the color palette that there are these two little boxes, and each one represents a different color. So the first one I'm going to select, and I will pick let's do this yellow, and the second one I will do black. So when I write with this, it's actually going to create that 3D effect. So Procreate is a little bit annoying in that once you go back into the brush palette, it switches them back and forth. So if I was to write again, it will still work. But if I want to change the colors at once, I need to change both of them. So let's do a red one for the first one and maybe a darker red for the second one. And so you see that's how it is going to, that is how it's going to layer those colors together. So just an important thing to remember when you're selecting your colors. And I've worked with a lot of other outline sets to kind of see what works and what doesn't. And one thing that I found is that you could be creating a letter, and when you start pairing those lines over each other, there's a noticeable overlap, and you have to go through it and erase your letters to make sure they all follow the same form. These ones don't have that same problem. So you can layer them on top of each other and they'll blend seamlessly. And if you do want to create layers on top of those, you can do so on a separate layer. So let me just clear this out, and I'll show you some more of these brushes. And I'll pick some more interesting colors too. So let's do a light blue and a black. Cool, that looks good. So, like I said, there's left and right chisels. So what I mean by that is the shadow's on the left side here, and it's on the right side over here. There are deeper versions of these as well, so they'll get thicker. And there's a variety of textures as well too. So this is fun because you can play with your pen pressure to get different textures and qualities on them. So you get some grungy edges, and this is almost like it's spray paint on a wall. So the fine liners give you the exact same 3D qualities as well, but these are going to respond differently to your pen pressure. And you can also play with the sizes here to make bigger lines or most often you're probably going to be working a little bit smaller here, and these are really expressive brushes, so those are fun to work with. The expressive styles are meant to be a little bit more straightforward for writing. So if you wanted to, mimic the capabilities of a marker here, that's probably what you would use those brushes for. And as always, you can play with the size. Each one has a different textural quality, so those can be fun to play around with. And again, when I go back into the second part of this video that details these brushes from a little bit more of a technical standpoint, you can learn how to manipulate these to suit your needs a little bit better in the brush configuration settings. So likewise, these ones also follow the same pattern as the ones above, where you have the fine liner versions of them, and these are the ones that are going to respond differently to your pen's pressure. Moving down in the outline chisels, there's a whole bunch of here, and again, I'm not going to go through all of them, but these, I'll just make these big so you can kind of see the textures in them. You can get some really cool textures that kind of mimic markers or different wall surfaces. They'll have different outline qualities. They'll respond to your pressure differently. And again, there's just a whole variety of these. So you can take those and pick those to suit your needs. Again, same deal with the outliners here. I'll show you some different ones. These ones follow like little shadows and have little flares off of them. Just kind of give it more of a unique gestural life. And then moving down into the textures here, again, you'll be familiar with these if you have used my Graffiti Pro Procreate brush set. So these are dynamically rotating brushes that will really respond differently to your size. So you can do little specks here and there based on how hard you hit. You'll get different size brushes, and even though it's the same brush stamp, each time it's going to be randomly placed based on your pen angle, as well as just the randomness of the brush's stamp qualities. So every time you put one of these down, you're not going to get the exact same result, so it doesn't look like this repeated stamp that is used everywhere. Some other subtle grunge effects that you can use to put down your background, scratches, and so on. So whole lot of variety here. I knew I kind of flew through all that, but hopefully you get a sense for what you can do with these brushes, especially when you start mixing in color. So what I'll do now is I'm going to get into a little bit more detail about how you can change the settings of these brushes or tweak them to suit your liking, as well as what you can do to make them a little bit more interesting. So what's worth noting with the majority of these brushes is that if you go into your brush studio here, there's going to be two brushes. And that is because one is the foreground color and then one is the background color. And what you apply in this color palette is the one on the left is going to affect the foreground, the one on the right is going to affect the background. So going back in here, if you wanted to change one of these brushes, in most cases, you're also going to want to change the second brush. So you'll see that all of these settings down here will repeat for the most part when you select these different brushes. So an example of this is the streamline. And what streamline does is it allows you to, I'm going to do one with the full streamline. So you see we get pretty smooth line here. If I go back in here and I turn the streamline all the way down, I got an old iPad, it's a little slow, but bear with me. So if I turn that streamline all the way down, I'm gonna get a little bit more of a wobbly line. And that may be desirable if you wanna have really expressive brushes, but if you only change the streamline on one of them, you'll see that none of those, or neither of those lines actually lined up. So if we wanna go back and change the streamline on the bottom brush to bring that down also, it's going to maintain its 3D consistency. But as you can see, this line is a little bit more wobbly than this line. And maybe you want wobbly lines, or maybe you just know how to work really fast and you're comfortable with your Apple Pencil, in which case you don't want Procreate kind of correcting your line for you. So that's something that I get a lot of emails about, so I just wanted to talk about that in the video just so I could point back to the folks who want to change those brushes to suit their liking. So what I'll also show you is a technique that I found myself using in some of the recent work that I've been creating. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna select a, let's see, I'll do the grunge shallow left. And let's change some colors here. So I think what I'll do is I'm gonna select kind of like a bright, kind of mustardy yellow, and I will do a black background here. And then I'm just gonna do like a little letter. And so let's just say that's a G. And what you can do is you can use your selection tool and you can select different portions of this letter. So for example, just to show you the brushes that I have here. So I have, or the layers that I have here, I have this G on one layer. And so if I select that layer and I go to the selection tool up here, I'm making sure that it is on automatic and it's on add, which means that every time I tap, it's gonna add to that selection. What you can also do is before I select anything, I can adjust the threshold here. So that's gonna go between 0 and 100. And I want it, you want to experiment with this. I think I generally want it like 40 to 50%. I'm gonna clear that selection and start again. And then when I tap the black here, you'll see that it grabbed that black. And I'm just gonna keep going. I'm gonna grab all the black and zoom in, grab this edge. And you don't have to go crazy here. Do what feels right before it gets annoying. And I'll select that last one. So I've selected the majority of the black here. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna copy and paste that. And what that did is it created this different layer from that selection that is just the black part of the G that we drew. So I'm gonna hide that. I'm gonna do the exact same thing with the yellow, and that seemed to grab a lot. So let's bring this threshold down a little bit. Make sure that we're selected here. Oops. Okay, so that grabbed a little bit of the G, and I realized I was on the wrong layer there. So I'm gonna bring this threshold up a little bit, let's say 50, and see how that goes. So again, make sure you're on a layer that you wanna select, because I wasn't. Also make sure you select the selection tool. All right, there we go. So now it's starting to grab the G, and it grabbed all the yellow for us. So I'm gonna copy and paste this again, and you'll see that now we just have the yellow part of the G. So if I put these together, it's pretty much back where I was, but these are now separated on different layers. So this is where it starts to get fun. So let's put the foreground on top of the background. And what we'll start doing here is we will add a new layer above the background. And I'm gonna set this to clipping mask. So what a clipping mask means is that everything that I paint on top of this layer, or paint on this layer, is only going to apply to the layer below it. So just to demonstrate that, if this was not a clipping mask, I'm just gonna grab an airbrush here, and I'm gonna select the color, let's do like kind of a rust red. If this is not a clipping mask, it's going to go on top of that background layer. But once I do make it a clipping mask, it's only going to apply to the layer below it. So what I can do is add some fading effects here. And obviously you can play with colors and do what looks good. But what I've been able to do now is I've been able to only write on that 3D layer. And so if I can do the same thing to the foreground layer, and I'll create a clipping mask and make my brush a little bit bigger, and this is where I can start creating that kind of gradient on the brushes. And now maybe you also want to add some outlines, so I can take that same brush, make it really small, and select like a white color. And obviously you'll do this with a little bit more precision, but that's a way you can start adding different layers to your letters. And let's say we wanted to give this a shadow as well. So what we can do there is let's take our original layer, which is just this G, and what we can do is put a clipping mask on top of it. And I'm just gonna select black, And I'm gonna take that airbrush again, and I'm just gonna color this all in so it's black. Now what I can do is I can select this layer below it, go to Gaussian blur, and blur this entire layer. So we have this, this big blur. It doesn't look like anything, but once we start applying our layers on top of it, it looks like it's actually sitting like in a 3D space and casting a shadow. So that's just kind of a workflow that I've found myself following for a lot of these pieces, and I will kind of show you that in action now. So I'm just gonna put these in a group so I can hide them. So in this one, you can see that I used a dark red as the 3D. I applied a lighter red as the kind of highlight here. I used a kind of pale yellow as the foreground color, added a deeper yellow at the bottom using the airbrush, and a more orange layer at the top. So it creates this nice shadowed gradation effect. Added some highlights, and then I did that Gaussian blur effect that I just showed you that kind of cast this shadow, and of course I added some of those texture brushes around it. So if we were to go back, we can apply some of those same texture brushes behind this one. And I'm just gonna create a white layer here. And then on top of that white layer, I'll create a new layer. And I'm gonna go back into the graffiti brushes and go all the way down to textures. And let's actually make this a more interesting background color. Maybe like a pink. And now on a new layer here, I'll go down to my scratches and I'll do like maybe a darker pink. So obviously I'm just kind of throwing random stuff down here, but if you're a little bit more calculated, you can see that you're able to create some really interesting textures and layers using the techniques that I just showed you. So anyway, I hope you like what you see, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'll be happy to answer, but they're a lot of fun, and if you're into Procreate and want to use it to recreate your street art or your calligraphy or even your calligraphy, then these are great brushes that can also add a different dimension with its color capabilities. So thanks for checking it out.